Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel, and welcome to this quiet evening journey through one of the most profound moments of the 20th century. Tonight we will not chase noise or excitement, but move slowly through memory, letting the mind drift gently as if it were walking among old ruins under a soft and distant moon. We will travel together to a city whose name became heavy in the memory of the world. We will not rush toward it, but approach it as someone walks down a long corridor in an old museum, surrounded by faded pictures that whisper many stories without ever raising their voice. We will look at this city not only as a battlefield, but as a wide page of history carefully folded. A page we can open slowly and contemplate in peace. And before we begin, remember to press like and subscribe to the channel, so you can travel with us every time to another age where details tell their stories without haste. Now I invite you to take a slow breath, let your shoulders loosen, and allow your eyelids to grow a little heavier as we begin this long, calm journey. Before Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance and endurance, it was a city beating to a very different rhythm, a rhythm that someone seeking rest tonight can easily imagine. It stretched along the wide Volga River, that slow-moving artery carrying small boats that glided in a steady pattern like a single long breath. The people of the city saw the river as part of their daily life, a source of trade, a place to escape in quiet moments, and a natural line dividing the two banks on which the city grew. In the early 1930s, Stalingrad was above all an industrial city, its large factories of red brick and iron spreading without hurry over wide areas. Between them ran dusty tracks and other roads laid with stone, where trucks rolled past, loaded with steel plates or parts of heavy machines. Despite the weight of industry, there was a different tone to everyday life, a tone you can now imagine as a low sound far away. It did not disturb anyone who listened. It was only a background hum to a much larger reality. Workers left their homes at dawn as the grey light slipped through low clouds and settled over the river and the city roofs. They walked with steady steps toward the great complexes like the tractor works and the big steel plant, places that would later become famous on the battlefield, but at that time were simply where people worked. They tried to arrive on time with the same routine repeated day after day, a quiet pattern that gave life a sense of order. The small markets were also an important part of the scene, wooden stalls offering seasonal vegetables and fruit, while the smell of fresh bread drifted from local bakeries. That warm smell mixed with the faint smoke of coal rising softly from chimneys as the city woke. Children played in the streets with simple games based mostly on running and chasing, or on a small stone thrown on the ground and picked up again. In those moments, the city carried no open warning about what was coming later. It was simply a large Soviet city trying to continue its industrial rise. And although the Soviet leadership pushed strongly to expand industry across the country, most people in Stalingrad lived their days without thinking much about global politics. Europe in the 1930s was full of tension. But those tensions sounded faint here, like distant winds, felt only when they suddenly shift direction. As the years passed, that distant wind began to change, not quickly, but like a slow drop in temperature as winter approaches. News arrived about German movements in the West, about expansion, agreements, and the collapse of old treaties. And though the Soviet Union had signed a pact of non-aggression with Germany in the year 1939, a quiet unease appeared in some hearts. It was not a sharp fear, more like a thin shadow that passed across the surface of life without ever disappearing completely. Then came the day of 22 June 1941, when the country awoke to the German surprise attack known as Operation Barbarossa. At the first moment, nothing changed in the streets of Stalingrad itself. The city was still far from the front. But the news alone was enough to interrupt its calm routine like a small wave that hesitates before reaching the shore. The factories began to work at a different pace, and the same workers who had always moved quietly in the morning now entered and left with a new and noticeable urgency. Trucks no longer carried only steel parts. They began to transport equipment prepared for future fronts. Even so, daily life tried to hold on to its calm shape because human beings cling to routine when the world around them starts to slip. Although the battle line had not yet approached, the summer of 1941 across the Soviet land felt different, the change not clear but present, like a blur at the edge of the horizon. As the first months of the German offensive passed, the tone of the news from the West began to change. At first, the reports of fighting sounded distant, full of names of towns most people in Stalingrad had never heard. But as winter approached, those reports grew heavier, more concrete, and harder to ignore. They were no longer just lines on maps printed in newspapers. They became stories told by men returning from the front and soldiers passing through the city on their way to new positions. In the small riverside cafes, where people sat in the evening warming their hands around heavy glasses of tea, conversations slowly became more serious. Yet even these conversations stayed quiet, colored by that familiar Soviet reserve, people sharing information as if they were talking about changing weather rather than war. There was no shouting and no dramatic fear, only a slow recognition that the conflict was not as far away as they had hoped. Still, the daily rhythm continued, because even when war approaches, it does not flood every corner of life at once. It leaves small spaces in between where people go on as if everything were normal. Workers rose at dawn, students went to school, shopkeepers opened their doors with the first light, and the general scene kept its calm tone. Only a few details began to signal a coming shift. Food lines grew a little longer, certain goods quietly disappeared from the markets, and soldiers passing through the streets became more numerous. Some factories began hiring women to replace men who had gone to fight. Small surface changes that were like delicate marks carved into stone, pointing to a slow but deep transformation. By the spring of 1942, the sound of the war drew nearer. No longer just a topic in the newspapers, but a movement that could be seen and measured in the south. German forces advanced across the Great Russian plains toward the rich resources of the Caucasus and strategic points along the Volga River. And with every step they took, the danger crept closer, like heavy fog rolling toward a sleeping city. The fog did not move quickly, but it did not stop. People along the riverbanks noticed unusual activity, larger boats and supplies moving at a steady pace, and teams of workers adjusting the railway lines and cargo areas. There was no clear announcement that the city itself had become a direct target, but every sign now suggested that this might soon be true. In party meetings, in factories, and in schools, words like defense and preparation began to appear more often. Yet people maintained a strange, almost magical calm. Not because they did not understand the danger, but because human nature often tries to protect itself from fear by holding on to familiar habits. Families still gathered at the end of the day, children ate simple soup, men read newspapers by dim yellow light inside communal buildings of brick that looked like large, quiet hives. As summer settled, the approach of the front became too clear to deny. Reconnaissance aircraft were sometimes seen far above, gliding so high that they made almost no sound, and the soldiers training within the city became part of the daily scenery. They drilled in wide squares or marched in small groups toward the eastern outskirts while the river kept flowing. The factories kept breathing smoke, and the sun rose over the city as if nothing had changed. In this coexistence of ordinary and extraordinary moments, people began to feel that the decisive hour was approaching, even though it had not yet been formally announced. By this time, Stalingrad was slowly turning from a quiet industrial city into a stage upon which a future battle would be set. A battle that would become one of the most deadly and influential of the century. In our calm telling, we will not leap into that battle, but move gently toward it, step by step, without rushing. At the start of the summer of 1942, the signs of danger became clearer, even though they appeared gradually, like a shadow lengthening on a wall as the evening light fades. Sirens were tested more often than before, sending a long sound that drifted quietly over the city, not followed by bombing at first. Just a warning tone that slid through the streets and echoed between concrete walls. People stepped out onto balconies or looked through windows and waited a few minutes, then returned to their tasks. Soon after, German planes began to appear at higher altitudes, not attacking in those early days but passing slowly overhead, drawing thin lines across the sky. Some watched them with contained worry, others looked at them as if they were no more than moving shadows above a blue surface. The planes were far enough away not to cause immediate panic, yet close enough to remind everyone that the war was no longer just a distant story. In July, residents noticed that some neighborhoods near the major factories were being surrounded with new barriers and checkpoints. More guards appeared, and public notices were posted reminding people to cover their windows at night and to avoid the riverbanks at certain hours. Nothing indicated that an attack would come the very next day, but all these small details began to collect like drops of water gathering on a cold window in the early morning. Even so, the rhythm of life refused to stop. The city showed a stubbornness, like a tree that keeps growing despite hard winds. Workers continued to go to the tractor works, to the great red steel plant, and the trucks still moved along the dusty roads carrying steel and engines. In the evening, people still sat in the parks near the river, listening to quiet music played through small loudspeakers or simply watching the unchanged movement of the water. Beneath this surface calm, a deeper awareness grew, an understanding that the city was now drawn clearly on the map of war. Danger was no longer just a possibility, it had become a reality waiting for the right moment to show its full shape. In early August, the event came that confirmed all earlier fears. A series of distant explosions was heard on the western side of the city, at first soft, like echoes of a remote storm, then gradually closer and clearer until the sound of shelling could be heard in neighborhoods near the river. These early explosions were not yet a direct bombardment of Stalingrad itself. They were the result of battles on its remote outskirts where Soviet forces clashed with advancing German units. The distance was still too great to see the smoke clearly, but the sound alone was enough to change something deep in the hearts of the people. From that day, many understood that Stalingrad was no longer a city behind the front. It had become part of the front. Official meetings multiplied, soldiers were seen more often, and rumors started to move through markets in low voices. Rumors of Germans nearing the Don River and the first defensive lines slowly falling back. These whispered stories mixed with fragments of truth, but everyone felt that the city was no longer standing at a safe distance. By mid-August, it seemed to many that they were living the last quiet days before a storm. Even as fear crept in, the inner narrative of the city remained surprisingly gentle. When fear first enters the human heart, the mind still clings to what is familiar. To the same streets, the same evening light, the same smells of factories breathing out their smoke at dusk. In this growing tension, we approach the days that would witness the first direct bombing, the moments that would change the face of Stalingrad entirely. On a morning in August 1942, the city woke to what appeared to be an ordinary day, the kind of day that begins with slow confidence, without any sign that it will end differently. The sun climbed a little above the Volga, and its light reflected softly on the slowly moving water. Workers headed toward the factories. Some children played in open, dusty yards, and small groups of people walked along the pavements near the river, wrapped in the quiet smells of coal and fresh bread. It was as if the city wanted to begin one last normal morning before it changed forever. Around 4 in the afternoon, a new sound arrived in the sky, deeper and heavier than the distant reconnaissance flights of the previous weeks. The noise of engines approached, not yet deafening, more like a low, continuous growl that grew stronger with each passing moment. People in the streets lifted their heads calmly as if searching for a strange cloud, and then the German bombers appeared in broad formations over the city. It took only a few moments before the first explosions were heard. The initial blasts were not yet the fiercest that history would remember, but they were loud enough, their echoes rolling slowly from district to district. The sky turned into a pale veil of smoke rising from different quarters, especially around the big factories and warehouses. Stalingrad seemed to slip suddenly into another world, one where the ordinary shapes of houses and streets were now blurred by dust and fire. During the following hours, the bombing continued in waves, aimed at industrial sites, transport lines, and eventually at residential areas as well. It was a terrifying day in reality. Yet, in our calm narration, you may imagine the smoke as a slow-moving curtain drawing itself across a wide stage. When evening finally arrived, the city had changed in ways that no one could have imagined that morning. Districts once full of markets and busy social life fell into a deeper silence, and several roads were now thick with fine dust raised by the blasts. Even there, people moved carefully through this early chaos, step by step, trying to understand what had happened. Many residents gathered near the river, not only out of fear, but in search of open space and air, a place where they could feel there was still room to breathe. The scene was not as loud as one might expect in such moments. It was more like a large, silent crowd staring at the distant lights of factories that still worked despite the bombing, as if the city itself wanted to show that it was not yet defeated. That night, many understood that Stalingrad was no longer just one point along the German advance. It had become the main target. Even so, the inhabitants moved with a kind of inner steadiness, carrying within them a quiet resolve that did not deny fear but accepted it in a way that could still be endured. By the end of August and the beginning of September 1942, Stalingrad had left the stage of waiting. It was no longer a city anticipating battle, it was a city living inside it. The air raids had opened the way to a new phase in which streets, buildings, and wide outskirts would become spaces through which ground forces advanced step by step. The battle was moving with a long, heavy breath toward the heart of the city. In early September, the advance elements of the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the edges of Stalingrad. The scene in the outskirts was now very different from the city of only a few weeks earlier. Roads, once used for trade and transport, had turned into broad military lanes. Dust rose slowly behind the movement of tanks and armored vehicles, while lines of infantry stretched across the surrounding plains, advancing in disciplined formations that looked like a long wave rolling forward without haste. Despite the closeness of the fighting, some outer areas still held traces of their former calm. Small orchards, scattered trees, and open ground once used for grazing. These peaceful spaces were now positions for artillery and strongpoints from which Both sides exchanged fire across open ground and around the big storage yards and factory districts. Between bursts of gunfire, silence always returned, a silence like the empty pause before the next step. Soviet forces under their commanders began to establish lines of defense in the western and southern suburbs. The Red Army was not in a strong position. The German advance had been swift and hard. Yet the defense was organized with a tough, practical clarity. Simple trenches were dug in lines, sniper posts appeared in half-ruined buildings, and roadblocks were built along major routes using heavy metal pieces taken from the factories themselves. The clashes in this period were not yet the narrow street battles that would later define the city. They were wide engagements fought in open ground, around warehouse clusters, and in large squares near the industrial zones. The sound of guns rolled gently across the air, not as a single endless roar, but as scattered waves of noise that rose and fell. Between those waves the light wind could be heard passing through broken wires and fragments of walls, as if nature continued its usual rhythm despite the enormous change. Some residents who had not yet left the city watched all this from what they thought were safe distances. They stood behind crumbling walls or peered from windows covered with cloth, seeing columns of tanks moving along the dusty tracks that led into the suburbs. The view was not full of shouting and bright color. It was a quiet but powerful sign that the city was preparing for a harsher chapter. The chapter that would begin when the enemy entered its core. When German troops finally pushed into the streets of Stalingrad proper, what they met was unlike anything they had seen in earlier campaigns. The city, though badly damaged, was still alive, resisting and breathing the heavy smoke of war. The German army advanced between shattered buildings, but there were no clear lines and no simple front. The entire city had become a maze of rubble, narrow corridors, and broken walls full of hidden defenders. With each step, the Germans found that the Soviet positions were not long, tidy trenches, but small points of resistance scattered with harsh precision. One burnt room might hold a single soldier. A collapsed cellar might conceal a machine gun. A rooftop could hide a silent sniper who had not missed a target in days. These methods were new to many German units that had expected Stalingrad to fall like other cities had fallen before. They did not yet understand that the city's very structure created the perfect stage for a new kind of warfare. A street-by-street struggle in which the defenders could use every piece of ruin to their advantage. While the Wehrmacht forces tried to push forward, they would sometimes hear not gunfire first, but the stillness that comes just before a shot. That short, quiet moment was frightening because they knew a sniper who had been watching them would not offer a second chance. Among the ruins, the Germans discovered something else. Every time they destroyed a building and believed they had cleared it, new Soviet soldiers seemed to rise out of the dust, as if the city itself were rebuilding its defenses from its own broken stones. With each sunset, it became clearer to them that entering the city had not been a simple advance, but stepping into a vast, silent trap that would drain their strength day after day. As September went on, Stalingrad slowly turned into a world ruled by shadows, rubble, and the quiet that comes before a shot is fired. The war was no longer just artillery and bombing, it had shifted into a struggle that hid itself in every corner, especially when the Soviets began to rely more and more on a weapon the Germans feared deeply: the snipers. The tall factory buildings, ruined workshops, and high floors without walls gave wide lines of sight, making every movement on the ground visible to those who could wait. Among the many sharpshooters, some names became legendary, the most famous being Vasily Zaitsev, the calm hunter from the Ural Mountains who found in this destroyed city the perfect stage for his deadly skill. Yet legend hides a deeper truth. Zaitsev was not alone. He was one among hundreds of snipers distributed in small teams across the city. Each team had one sniper and one observer, sometimes 3 or 4 men, moving quietly from place to place and changing their positions daily to avoid discovery. Over time, the Germans realized they were no longer facing a single visible army but something more like ghosts, moving from window to window and rooftop to rooftop in a city whose shape changed every hour. A sniper's day began in silence. He waited for the first light to draw new lines of shadow across the rubble, then studied the scene for the slightest unusual movement, a helmet turning, a body bending, or an officer standing in an exposed place without realizing that a patient I was watching. This was a war of patience more than anything else. A sniper might remain still for hours, not speaking, barely moving, holding his rifle close as if it were part of his own body, waiting for a moment that might never come. The Germans tried to counter this threat in many ways. They brought in their own skilled marksmen, recalled experienced snipers from other fronts, and even sent specialists from training schools to hunt the Soviet sharpshooters. These duels would later be told as stories where the silence between the shots was more tense than the bullets themselves. In Stalingrad, a sniper did not simply aim at one soldier, he aimed at the heart of a whole unit. If he hit the commander of a platoon, the soldiers under him hesitated and stopped moving. If he killed a truck driver, an entire day of supplies could be delayed for a whole district. The single bullet could change the movement of a whole section of the front. The war was not limited to daylight. At night, when the city's shapes dissolved into darkness, silence itself became another weapon, and small sniper teams moved carefully among the ruins, trying to predict German positions and build mental maps based on the shadows of the moon and the sound of steps on glass and stone. Often the two sides exchanged shots without ever clearly seeing one another. Sharp sounds echoed between shattered walls until it seemed that the bullets came from every direction at once. German infantrymen lived in constant fear of being hit by a shot that appeared from nowhere, a shot they heard only when it was too late. Week after week, the snipers left their mark on the battle. German troops who had once moved forward confidently were now forced to advance with great caution, bending low, stopping often, searching with their eyes before taking each step, aware that the danger might be above them, behind them, or somewhere they could not even see. Stalingrad was full of sounds, yet what many remembered later was the quiet that came before the crack of a rifle, the quiet in which even the breathing of the city seemed to join the war of shadows. At the same time, the three great factories of Stalingrad, the Red October steel plant, the barricade armaments works, and the tractor factory, formed an industrial spine that slowly changed from a cluster of noisy workshops into a landscape of fighting grounds. Although the German bombardment had destroyed much of their productive capacity, these factories near the Volga turned into natural fortresses. They were filled with metal walkways, deep rooms, and old furnaces that now served as strong shelters. On a dark morning in October 1942, the Wehrmacht launched a major assault on the factory district, hoping that capturing these sites would open the way to the riverbank and force the Soviets to withdraw. Yet every step inside this industrial quarter was like entering a new world of confusion and danger, a world with its own rhythm and heavy silence. In the tractor factory, the half-finished tanks, huge frames lying on their sides, and the iron pillars that once supported cranes now provided near-perfect cover for Soviet defenders. A soldier did not hide behind an ordinary wall, but behind the skeleton of a tank still waiting for its engine, behind a large engine block used as a shield, or in a drainage pit in the concrete floor that became a shelter for 3 men waiting for the next assault. German heavy weapons, so powerful in open terrain, lost much of their value among these tangled lines of metal and shadow. The battle turned into very close-range fighting, where a man could hear the breathing of his enemy before seeing him. The factory known as Red October became almost like a city within the city. Its large work halls, high ceilings, and interlocked stairways formed a three-dimensional battlefield where danger came from below, above, and at eye level all at once. Soviet fighters moved in small groups that knew every corner of the plant. They knew which crane arm could be, climbed which platform could hide 3 snipers, and which old service trench for cables could be used as a hidden tunnel. The Germans relied heavily on grenades and explosive charges, but the countless corners and corridors limited their effect. After each explosion, dust filled the air and visibility shrank until a soldier could hear echoes more clearly than he could see figures. In the barricade factory where ammunition had once been produced, the danger was doubled. Scattered powder, half-emptied storage rooms, and chemical materials left behind made every exchange of fire heavy with the risk of sudden fire and uncontrolled blast. A single nervous shot striking the wrong surface could ignite something whose full effect no one could predict. Yet the struggle continued day after day until the factory was reduced to layers of ash and twisted iron. Even then, the Soviet lines refused to collapse. Small groups of 10 soldiers or fewer managed to repel larger attacks by using their intimate knowledge of every ledge and back passage. As the days progressed, the Germans began to feel the depth of their problem. They had not entered a single building, but a network of connected structures where each room demanded its own battle. Each staircase might hide a trap, and a single crack in a wall could conceal a waiting machine gun. At night, the factories were especially frightening. The silence inside the huge halls felt endless, echoing each step and every small movement, blending the sound of shifting metal with the cold breath of the wind. By mid-October, the 3 factories had become steel and concrete fortresses. They were no longer just industrial sites, but symbols of Stalingrad's resistance. Small cities within the larger ruined city that maintained their own fronts and refused to bow to German superiority. While German commanders believed that capturing the factories was only a matter of time, the Soviet defenders saw them differently. To them, these buildings formed the last barrier before the Volga, the final wall before the eastern bank would be lost, and they were determined to hold them as long as any man could stand. As the fighting raged in the factories, November 1942 arrived, bringing with it both exhaustion and the first signs of a deeper change. The city still burned, its streets were full of rubble, its factories shattered, and even the air felt heavy in the lungs of soldiers. Yet behind this dark picture, something else was forming, something the Germans did not see clearly at first. While Wehrmacht units allowed themselves quiet celebrations, thinking that the end of the battle was near, the Soviet High Command was preparing a broader plan. Their strategy was not merely to survive inside the ruins, but to turn the entire situation upside down through a large, carefully coordinated operation spread across several armies. This plan had a code name, Uranus, and its aim was to reverse the course of the war on this front. Inside Stalingrad, the Soviet soldiers defending the last fragments of the city lived in almost unbearable conditions. Their clothing no longer protected them from the cold of the Volga winter. Food arrived irregularly or not at all, and even water sometimes demanded a dangerous journey to the river under the watchful eyes of German snipers on the opposite bank. Despite all of this, the defensive lines held, as if the city, with what remained of it, refused to move back another step. The soldiers understood that they were not just protecting a strip of land. They were part of a larger design whose full shape had not been revealed to them, but which they sensed in small changes. They noticed more heavy artillery behind their positions, unusual movement on the far bank, and a strange slowing down in the tempo of German attacks, as if both sides were holding their breath. On the German side, there was still deep confidence, perhaps too deep. They believed they had captured nearly all the useful buildings, and that the Red Army no longer had room to maneuver, and some reports to higher command suggested that the matter was one of days. What those reports ignored was that the Sixth Army lines were now stretched thin, extended deeply into a destroyed city, while their flanks to the northwest and southwest were held not by strong German units, but by Allied troops with weaker equipment. These Allied formations, many of them Romanian, were expected to hold broad frontages with limited armor and insufficient winter supplies. Their vulnerability was visible for those who looked closely, yet it was not taken seriously enough. Outside the city, the Soviets were building something like the quiet at the center of a storm, the stillness that comes just before an irreversible change. German soldiers inside Stalingrad sensed a slight shift in the atmosphere, but could not identify its cause. There were no massive offensives, only small skirmishes and occasional bursts of fire. But at night, some could hear far off the muffled echo of Soviet guns moving into place and the grinding of heavy engines and metal on the distant eastern bank. German command assumed this was nothing more than desperate reinforcement for the defenders, especially as temperatures dropped towards freezing and ice began to form on the ruins. They believed winter would work in their favor, as it had in earlier campaigns. This time they were mistaken, because the Soviets had studied the weather carefully and equipped their troops with better clothing, using the frozen ground to move more quickly than the Germans expected. By mid-November, elements of the Red Army were quietly gathering in wide arcs around Stalingrad, one group to the northwest, another to the southwest, with large reserves behind them. All were waiting for a signal that would redraw the map of the war. Inside the ruined city, the defenders continued to fight street by street, as if someone would come to rescue them, holding ground even when it was reduced to a few meters of earth. Then, on a strangely quiet night, a feeling spread that something in the air had changed. There were no heavy attacks and little movement along the immediate front, but in the far distance there was a faint, continuous rumble, like a soft murmur from the earth itself. That quiet vibration was the last moment before one of the largest counterattacks of the Eastern Front, the beginning of an operation that would turn the Sixth Army from an attacking force into a trapped one. On the morning of 19th November 1942, the northwestern front around Stalingrad woke to a sound that had not been heard for weeks. It was not scattered rifle fire or the usual artillery patterns, but a deeper, almost solid wall of noise. It was as if the flatlands beyond the horizon had begun to move, or as if the earth was breathing in preparation for something larger than anything visible. This was the opening of Operation Uranus, one of the most massive Soviet offensives of the war, launched with precise timing on two main fronts, one from the northwest and another from the southwest. Between these two thrusts were spread exhausted Romanian forces, stretched thin along the lines, with weapons and armor far inferior to those of their opponents. Many of these soldiers held old rifles, lacked enough tanks to face the Soviet T-34s, and suffered from shortages in ammunition and winter supplies. They did not know that behind the Soviet lines more than 200,000 soldiers were assembled, supported by thousands of guns and hundreds of tanks and cavalry and artillery units. At around 7:30 in the morning, the quiet was shattered by a torrent of Soviet shells that fell thickly on the Romanian positions. Witnesses later said that the sky turned into a moving grey curtain filled with smoke and dust. This bombardment was not just a routine preparation. It was designed to rip apart the entire defensive line before the infantry even began to advance. The shells struck command posts, communication lines, ammunition depots, and the narrow tracks that the Romanians needed for retreat or maneuver. While the battered defenders tried to reorganize themselves, Soviet units began moving forward behind the fire in steady lines. Infantry wrapped in thick winter coats advancing after T-34 tanks that seemed to glide over the snow, ignoring the scattered bullets that bounced off their frontal armor. Within less than 2 hours, the first defensive sectors started to break apart. It was not only the force of the attack, but the shock of its scale that overwhelmed troops who had recently faced only limited local actions. Inside Stalingrad, the Sixth Army had little idea of what was unfolding outside. Its soldiers were locked in their own hard-fighting inside ruins, relying on late reports that did not show the full picture, and they could not imagine that the outer ring that looked so stable was now crumbling at an alarming speed. While the offensive struck from the northwest, a similar assault began from the southwest on the following day, the 20th of November. This time, the Soviet forces faced the Romanian Fourth Army, which was even less prepared and more poorly equipped. The first waves of the attack quickly forced many units into disordered retreat, opening wide gaps in the line. Through those gaps, the Soviet armor poured like metallic rivers, sweeping aside one position after another while the infantry followed steadily across the frozen ground. Romanian attempts to regroup were hampered by failing communications and the rapid collapse of their positions. Within 3 days, the Soviet drives began to curve inward in a wide arc, aiming to meet behind the Germans. The plan from the start had been clear: to strike the flanks, drive deep, and then join hands in the rear of the enemy's main force, closing a circle around the entire Sixth Army. At that time, the army had more than 200,000 men spread through the city, the factory district, and the surrounding areas, deep inside territory that was now cut off from the main German fronts and protected only by Allied units already broken. On the evening of 22 November, Soviet units advancing from north and south met near the town of Kalak. It was a small point on the map, but that meeting changed the course of the war. From that moment, Stalingrad and the German forces within it became an isolated pocket with no land corridor for supplies, ammunition, or reinforcements. The Sixth Army was trapped in a shattered city, surrounded on all sides and severed from the rest of the Eastern Front. That night, many German soldiers paused in their fighting and looked out toward the dark, frozen plains where they had once expected help and new supplies. They saw only silence and emptiness. The shock of encirclement was more than a piece of military news. It was like a heavy weight settling on thousands of minds. Gradually, the soldiers realized that the battle they had entered was no longer one of advance, but one of survival, and that the large, powerful formation they belonged to had become a trapped force inside a city that no longer allowed easy escape. Winter had just begun, and the world was about to see one of the harshest and darkest chapters of the war, the long siege of Stalingrad. When the circle closed around the city, it seemed as if Stalingrad itself began to breathe with difficulty. Life inside no longer depended on lines and outer districts alone, but on everyday routines that were now being crushed by hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The air felt shorter, food became scarcer, and winter nights stretched so long that time itself seemed to slow. After the Soviet armies met at Kalok and sealed the encirclement at the end of November, the Sixth Army changed from an attacking formation into a besieged one. Hundreds of units were trapped among the ruins, surrounded by numerically superior forces and cut off from normal supply routes. Getting water became more dangerous. The man carrying buckets through alleys might never return if a sniper saw him or a fragment caught him. The turning of the season from late autumn to deep winter did not ease the suffering. It added to it, bringing hard frost that coated the ruins and made every movement heavy and risky. Inside, logistical problems grew quickly. Food stocks dropped, rations were reduced to thin portions, small pieces of bread, weak soup, or sometimes nothing at all. The soldiers had been used to regular resupply, but now the roads were blocked or under enemy fire, and the days when crates of food arrived with the morning seemed far away. Hunger began to change behavior, slowing movements, dulling concentration, and leaving a constant sense of cold in fingers and feet, even when men tried to stay active. German command decided to rely on air supply as the main solution. On paper, it seemed simple. Aircraft would bring in food and ammunition and carry out the wounded until relief forces could break the encirclement. Requests were made and promises were given that the army could be kept alive from the sky. For a while, this brought a thin thread of hope. But what looked reasonable on a map did not match the reality of severe winter weather and constant Soviet air and ground attacks. Low clouds, blizzards, and fog turned every flight into a gamble, with pilots facing not only anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, but also poor visibility and icy improvised landing strips. Many aircraft could not land safely in or near the city. Some were damaged, others never returned. The transport planes were limited in number and capacity. They could not deliver anything close to the daily tonnage needed to keep such a large army supplied, and each lost plane reduced that capacity further. Instead of becoming a stable lifeline, the air bridge turned into a series of uncertain trips, sometimes successful, often partial, and occasionally failing completely. Men waiting for crates of food and ammunition watched the sky with unease rather than faith. The sky had become part of their struggle, a source of flickering hope and constant danger when aircraft were shot down or crashed in the frozen fields. As food became rarer, health problems appeared quickly. Men suffered from chronic weakness, dramatic loss of weight, and illnesses linked to poor nutrition and constant cold, especially among civilians who depended entirely on irregular military supplies. Simple surgery that once required clean tools and medicine now became almost impossible, and wounds or infections that could have been treated turned into life-threatening conditions. Frostbite became common, fingers and toes darkened and lost feeling, and some soldiers could no longer walk or fight. Psychological strain grew alongside physical exhaustion. The siege made the sense of isolation deeper with every day, until many felt cut off from any wider world. Time lost its clear shape, and the soldiers no longer knew whether their leaders had a concrete plan to save them or whether they were simply holding out without purpose. Letters arrived rarely and often after long delays, and hopes of going home gradually faded into faint memories of a different life. The breakdown in morale did not mean open revolt. It showed itself as a deep tiredness. Faces grew more hollow, conversations shorter and quieter. Long silences filled the dugouts where men sat close to small fires that struggled against the freezing air. Some tried to keep spirits up by talking about the future, but their words often ended in half sentences and pale smiles cut off by distant explosions. Military doctors recorded worrying rises in sickness related to hunger and cold, pneumonia, exhaustion, and repeated fainting. Many who might have been saved under normal conditions died simply because medicine and equipment were lacking. The smell inside improvised field hospitals, a mix of blood, smoke, and damp clothes, created the sense of another silent war being fought behind the walls. The German leadership inside Stalingrad tried to show firmness in their official reports. The written messages spoke of holding out and determination, but inside the command rooms, the numbers told a more troubling story. Ammunition running low, fuel almost gone, aircraft losses mounting, and steady Soviet pressure at key points. Still, there was hope that a relief effort from outside might break the ring. The plan that would later be known as Operation Winter Storm offered a fragile line of expectation for many inside the pocket. But that line was thin and fragile. On the Soviet side, soldiers were also suffering from cold and hardship, but their supply lines, though strained, still functioned, and they were fighting near their own homeland, with the knowledge that behind them lay their own villages and families. For the Germans, the sense of distance and estrangement from anything familiar made the burden heavier. Day by day it became natural for a man to collapse from fatigue or sit for a long time in a trench without moving, as if trying to think of a next step he no longer had strength to take. On quiet nights, the wind moving through the ruins sounded like long whispers telling the men that this would not end soon. Even in this slow collapse, there were small acts of daily courage. A soldier jumping to help a freezing comrade, another sharing his tiny ration with someone weaker, an officer trying to say a few honest words to keep his unit together. These gestures did not change the course of the war, but they gave the men simple, real reasons to endure for one more day. As winter reached its hardest phase and the weeks of encirclement dragged on, the Sixth Army felt the city closing in on them, as if invisible walls were shrinking around every street and shelter. It was no longer just a matter of missing supplies or physical fatigue. It was the daily sight of an army losing the basic tools it needed to fight or even to exist. The quiet in parts of the front could almost trick the listener into thinking the battle had relaxed. But in truth, that silence meant the army could no longer answer with the same intensity as before. Ammunition that once fed heavy barrages was now counted bullet by bullet, often being saved for imagined emergencies that never came. Artillery that had played a central role at the beginning of the battle slowly disappeared from the front. Not only because many guns were destroyed, but because fuel and shells had become too rare to use. Whole units stood in the snow, unable to maneuver, their trucks gone or abandoned and their armored vehicles frozen in place, empty of fuel and life. Some soldiers turned these dead machines into crude shelters, preferring their cold metal shells to the open air. Time itself became difficult to bear. The long nights and short days flowed together, with only slight shifts in the color of the sky marking the passage of hours. Field shelters dug into the ruins turned into centers of survival rather than fighting positions. Men lay wrapped in thin blankets, waiting for anything: a crumb of bread, a cup of warm drink, a message, while knowing that such things might not come. The Volga on the far side of the battlefield continued to flow, its banks frozen and white, yet its waters never truly stopping. That river, part of the original Soviet defensive plan, had now become a symbol of the difference between the two sides. Soviet forces could still move men and supplies across it despite the risk, while the Germans depended on an air bridge that was shrinking day by day. Civilian survivors inside the pocket entered one of the most painful phases of the siege. Their homes had long since collapsed, and shared shelters grew ever more crowded and desperate, children wasting away, women searching for any piece of wood to burn, any scrap to provide a moment of warmth. German attempts to ration the remaining resources could not stop everything from running out. Food, medicine, coal, even warm clothing. Commanders inside the city received reports that no longer spoke of units at full strength, but of empty stores, dead vehicles, and men on the edge of collapse. From outside they were still ordered to hold their positions, as if the encirclement could somehow be broken by forces that no longer existed. Within the command posts, discussions shifted from how to attack or maneuver, to how to divide the last supplies in a way that might let the army survive a little longer. General Paulus understood that the endings of armies rarely come with a single loud event. They form slowly from accumulated shortages that cannot be repaired. They were no longer counting hundreds of tanks, but a few that could still move. They were not measuring ammunition in tons, but in crates, carefully guarded. Alongside this material decline, the human numbers fell as well. More soldiers were too sick or injured to fight, and the proportion of men still capable of combat shrank each day. By late December 1942, Stalingrad had become a vast pit of ash, twisted metal, and rubble that seemed to spell only one word: ending. The German soldiers did not need a formal statement to know that everything was falling apart. It was enough to look around at units that had once been tight blocks of discipline and now were scattered groups, separated and leaderless in many places. Collapse did not arrive in a single blow. It came as squads losing members, companies losing contact, platoons buried under collapsing walls, and others simply disappearing in the snow and smoke. Maps still showed neat formations and positions, but in reality many of those units existed only as names. Field officers tried hard to preserve the image of an organized army. In truth, the neat order that had once been a source of pride had dissolved in ways no one had predicted. Foxholes in the snow became command posts, ruined houses turned into gathering points, old trenches became final lines, and empty depots were treated as if they were still supply centers. With each passing hour, the army lost another piece of itself. A soldier vanishing while searching for wood and never returning, a group losing its way in a snowstorm, a whole position forced to surrender after running out of ammunition. Those who remained spoke more quietly, turned inward, and asked themselves whether anything still made sense. Signs of collapse were everywhere. Men who had once fought fiercely now moved without energy, their eyes fixed on nothing, their voices flat, some falling into fits of despair, others simply staring. A few tried to write farewell letters, even when they knew those letters would never leave the ruins. In the last days, commanders attempted once more to rebuild a coherent front, gathering fragments of different battalions into temporary groups, ordering movements along roads that no longer truly existed, redrawing defense lines on maps that no longer matched the real ground. Every attempt met the same wall. Radios failed in the cold. The city's shape had changed so much that no one was sure where a line began or ended, and positions assigned to be held were often already in Soviet hands. Individual courage still appeared, but courage alone could not reverse the tide. Later, one officer would write that they were no longer an army, but a cluster of small human islands, each fighting to gain one more hour. Inside shattered buildings, men now hid more from the cold than from enemy bullets. They scraped coal from burned houses, melted snow for water, and searched for anything that could be eaten or used, while the organized structure of the army dissolved further. Yet, even among the wreckage, there were brief moments when someone tried to hold onto a sense of duty. A corporal calling scattered comrades together, a small group arriving just in time to hold a crumbling line for a few extra hours. Those efforts were like placing small pieces of wood on a sinking ship, honest but unable to stop the final outcome. After all this disintegration, the Sixth Army was a hollow mass, without real striking power, without fuel, and with hardly any ability to attack or even defend effectively. Internal decay completed what hunger, cold, and shelling had begun. By January 1943, the truth that many had avoided speaking aloud was undeniable. The Sixth Army would not be saved. Accepting that reality was another internal collapse for the German soldiers, a breaking that happened in the spirit after so many blows to the body. For the first time since the start of the siege, almost no one spoke seriously of a counterattack or of breaking the encirclement. A deep silence settled over positions, trenches, and ruined buildings. A silence in which everyone understood they were living the last days. That the end would not be a dramatic victory or escape, but a slow fading. The High Command in Berlin continued to broadcast messages filled with phrases about holding out, about approaching reinforcements, about breaking the Soviet ring, but men in the ruins listened with eyes that no longer believed. They saw with their own gaze that no new forces were coming, no supply columns were forming, and that their struggle had become more symbol than reality. Even General Paulus, who had long insisted that his army would fight until help arrived, began to speak with a weaker tone, as if he himself had lost faith in the promises. In the final days before the end, hunger was no longer a passing feeling, it was part of the soldiers themselves. They moved with extreme slowness, as if their souls weighed more than their bodies, and the appearance of any food, even a piece of very old bread, became an event. Some found sacks of grain or scraps in ruined stores and shared them among many men. Others reached the point of eating things they never would have imagined touching in another life. Hunger turned them into pale figures moving over the snow, and sometimes they simply collapsed without a word. Falling was no longer mainly the result of bullets, but of a spirit that had burned itself out. In the last weeks, the Soviets recorded numerous cases of German soldiers found sitting in ruins, rifles by their side, motionless. They were not dead, but no longer able to fight or even lift their weapons, their hands cracked by frost, their limbs blue, their breathing short, and their eyes empty. At that point, Soviet observers understood that the German force in Stalingrad was no longer an army in the full sense. It was a vast, exhausted body waiting for the final moment. Attempts to draw new defensive lines inside the city were like drawing shapes on ice that would soon crack. Every time an order went out to hold a particular street, that street often fell within hours, and newly formed groups vanished in a single day due to lack of men and ammunition. Some officers walked among the ruins, calling out and trying to gather fighters, but the soldiers who heard them were no longer the same men who had entered the city months before. They were worn down, starving, frozen, and drained of hope. Many no longer truly believed they would ever leave the ruins alive. In that time, a strange attitude appeared among some. They stopped seeing death as something to fear and began to see it as an exit from a story that no longer seemed to have a meaning. They did not have the energy to hate, to fight fiercely, or even to be deeply afraid. They were simply tired beyond words. Guilt touched many of them. Guilt for still being alive when so many comrades had died. Anger that no one had come to rescue them, and a hollow emptiness that was perhaps the hardest feeling of all. When the Red Army closed in on the final strongholds and surrounded the last headquarters, German soldiers no longer required detailed military explanations to understand that it was over. They knew by the silence on the radios, by the disappearance of local commanders, by the complete absence of supplies, and by the shrinking number of points still under their control. Stalingrad had become a vast mound of rubble with almost no remaining strategic value. In that frozen moment, something strange happened inside many of them. For the first time in months, they no longer talked of survival, but only of how and when this ordeal would end. By mid-January 1943, the encirclement around the Sixth Army was complete in a way that could not be undone. The city that had once been full of life was now a quiet ruin where burned-out buildings, piles of debris, and snow covered everything. The air felt heavy with each step and each breath, and both soldiers and officers sensed that the end was no longer a question but a near certainty. The last defensive positions were little more than the shells of factories and industrial structures in the center. Buildings so damaged that they hardly offered real protection anymore. Streets had turned into dangerous passageways filled with fragments and bodies and snow, and the remaining field units had almost no strength left. The Red Army attacked with organized and well-supplied formations, supported by secure lines of supply that stretched back behind the Volga. With each attack, German positions shrank in size and capability. Lack of ammunition, hunger, and cold made resistance weaker and more fragile, and while the last groups of fighters struggled to hold on, civilians who had endured the whole siege began to collapse in greater numbers. Children, weakened by long hunger, could barely stand. Women and the elderly moved slowly, if at all, often relying on others to help them. Sometimes soldiers shared their last crumbs with families, further draining their own resources and deepening the sense of shared suffering. This sight did not only wear down bodies, it weighed heavily on the spirit. Many soldiers felt a sharp sadness for being alive, while others starved around them, and this feeling could hurt more than any shell or bullet. After repeated failures of air supply and the near exhaustion of local stocks, the Sixth Army was surviving on almost nothing. Fuel had run out to the point that heavy machinery could no longer move, guns could not be repositioned, and even those artillery pieces still intact fell silent for lack of shells. There was no practical way to bring in more from outside, because the Red Army had firm control over the surrounding land and air. In the face of this reality, there was no longer anything to support the army in a meaningful way, neither food in sufficient quantity, nor fuel, nor ammunition. On the 31st of January 1943, under constant Soviet pressure, German soldiers began surrendering in groups. They laid down their weapons bit by bit in a process that sounded less like a dramatic finale and more like a long, tired exhalation. The first to surrender were those who had quite literally nothing with which to continue the fight. They were followed by the remaining headquarters and scattered units until the city passed completely into Soviet hands. Leading officers such as Paulus were taken prisoner, along with those soldiers who still stood near them. The surrender itself was quiet, almost without major battles in the final hours, because the internal collapse had already ended the army's ability to resist. Stalingrad did not fall to bombardment alone. It fell through a steady sequence of failures and wearings down, logistical breakdown, psychological strain, internal disintegration of units, and erosion of the military structure that supported them. When the last German pockets were gone, one of the most intense battles in modern history came to an end. The army that had once been a powerful spearhead was now a captured mass, its morale broken, most of its members dead or in captivity. The effect of the siege extended far beyond military statistics. The survivors carried with them not only memories of shells and bullets, but stronger memories of hunger, cold, confusion, and slow inner collapse. Stalingrad ceased to be simply a city on a map and became a symbol of what happens when a force is surrounded and slowly drained without rescue. After the end of the siege, the city left a deep mark on the world, not only in strategic terms but in human terms. The place that had once been a lively industrial center lay under snow and ash, its ruins holding the stories of thousands of soldiers and civilians who had lived through extreme hardship. Stalingrad became a harsh reminder that military strength alone is not enough. that endurance depends not only on weapons, but on logistics, planning, and, above all, morale. Hunger, cold, and inner breakdown had a more decisive impact than many shells and bombs. Chaos, poor communication, and psychological fragmentation all combined to make the Sixth Army fall before the final shots were fired. Yet, despite the devastation, the city remained a sign of human resistance in the face of trial. Imagine now the soldiers standing in broken streets, breathing air thick with cold and smoke, slowly absorbing the bitter truth that their part in this story had ended and that all that remained was surrender. The civilians who had endured months of siege were exhausted and weak, yet those who survived witnessed the final moment with eyes that still held something human. Every broken concrete piece, every shattered window, and every street running between the ruins became a silent witness for those who lived and those who did not. If we stand today on the ground of the modern city, now called Volgograd, we would see trees, parks, and new buildings where ruins once stood. The quiet that hangs over it now is a different kind of silence, not the silence of war, but a gentle calm that allows space for reflection, thought, and perhaps sleep after a long journey into the past. History here teaches something important. Even in the harshest wars and deepest trials, life can find a way back. Pain can turn into memory, and destruction into a lesson. Now that we have walked slowly through the story of Stalingrad from beginning to end, we can allow our eyes to close for a few moments. We can imagine the snow that once covered the ruins, the cold winds that swept through the streets, and the silence that settled after all the noise. And we can feel a quiet gratitude for the peace we have now, for warm homes, for food within reach, for a life that continued despite everything that happened there. Stalingrad, with all the suffering that unfolded within its streets, still offers lessons of patience, endurance, and hope, teaching us that even a faint light can give meaning to life after darkness, and that after every long and difficult storm there can come, at last, a deep and healing calm. So may your night now be gentle, and may you drift into sleep in safety and peace.